All right, picture this. You're prepping, right, for like a high-stakes meeting, dealing with U.S.-Russia relations. Got all your talking points set, sanctions, diplomacy, the whole shebang.
Right.
But then, out of nowhere, someone hits you with this curveball. What about the Russian people? Like, are they really on board for nuclear war? And you're sitting there thinking, well, obviously. I mean, everyone knows that.
Yeah, we think we have the answer. It's almost taken for granted.
Exactly. But what if? What if those assumptions we're making? What if they're not just wrong, but like dangerously wrong?
It's fascinating, how often our perceptions of entire nations, especially in these really high-stakes areas, are based on very shaky ground.
And that's what makes this deep dive so crucial, honestly. We're diving headfirst into a 2024 study from, get this, the Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly by these researchers, Laskin and Nasova.
Okay, interesting.
And their goal is super relevant. They wanted to move past all that Cold War baggage, the stuff that stuck with us, and really understand what young Americans and Russians, the future generations of these two global superpowers, really think about nuclear war today.
The future generations, that's key, right? I mean, they're the ones who inherit the consequences of the decisions we're making right now.
Totally. And this study, it kind of gives us a glimpse, almost like a peek into the future of this whole U.S.-Russia relationship without, all that baggage from the past.
It's a fresh perspective.
Totally. So we're not talking dusty history books, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the generation that practically grew up with the internet at their fingertips.
Yeah.
But they've got access to information like never before.
Yeah.
But here's the question. Does all that information actually translate to a deeper understanding?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something the study tackles head-on using this idea called co-orientation.
Co-orientation.
Yeah, basically it's about how well two groups actually understand each other's views.
Okay, break that down for me.
So picture this. Imagine two people, right, looking at the same sculpture. One standing right up close, the other's way back. Same object, but two totally different perspectives, right?
Okay, yeah, I get that.
Co-orientation is about mapping those viewpoints, even if they completely disagree.
So it's not even about whether Americans and Russians see eye to eye on nuclear war. It's about whether they even grasp where the other side is coming from.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because Laskin and Nasova, they didn't just stop at agreement, they went deeper, looking at accuracy too.
Accuracy.
It's one thing to disagree, right? We all do that. But it's a whole other thing when one side totally misjudges, like completely misreads what the other side actually believes.
And spoiler alert, that's exactly what they found.
Yeah.
Like big time.
Big time. Now, before we jump into all the surprising stuff, let's start with some common ground. The study found that, thankfully, both American and Russian students saw nuclear war as a serious threat. Like, nobody was rooting for a nuclear winter or anything.
Right.
And kind of surprisingly, they even had pretty similar views on the current state of relations between the U.S. and Russia, which I think is a good reminder that, hey, we're not dealing with these two completely alien worlds here. There's some common ground.
Yeah, so on the surface, it sounds like, okay, phew, everyone agrees this would be really bad news. We're good, right? But that's where things take a bit of a turn, right? Because while they agreed on the problem itself, Americans were way off when it came to how Russians felt about it. They pictured Russians as way more, I don't know, like cavalier about nuclear war than the data actually showed.
It's like we're letting our own biases, our own anxieties color how we see the other, And the study actually gave this a name, imbalanced co-orientation. Basically, it means one side's understanding is totally out of whack.
Imbalanced co-orientation. So we're not just talking about a difference of opinion. We're talking about a fundamental disconnect in how we understand each other. And that's not just some abstract academic thing, right? Like, that has real-world implications. Take, for example, what the study found about willingness to sacrifice one's life in a nuclear war.
Yeah, that's where things get, well, kind of scary, honestly. Because the study found that only a tiny percentage of the Russian students, like 2.5 out of 10, agreed with that statement about sacrificing themselves, which, by the way, was basically the same as the American students.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty eye-opening, right? But the Americans, they were convinced that Russians were all gung-ho about self-sacrifice.
So we're talking about, like, the ultimate sacrifice, right? Life or death decisions, the potential for conflict. And one side has this totally warped view of what the other actually believes.
It's like trying to have a conversation through, I don't know, one of those distorted mirrors at a carnival, everything's out of whack.
Totally. And it wasn't just that one question either. The study found this whole pattern, right? Like, Americans consistently overestimated Russian support for using nukes first, even viewing nuclear war as, like, inevitable. But the Russian students, their views were much more grounded, not just about themselves, but about Americans, too.
Hmm.
So it's almost like, and this is kind of unsettling, but it's like Americans projected this image of Russia, right? This reckless, trigger-happy image, while the data shows something a lot more nuanced.
It's way more complicated than that.
Exactly. And it wasn't all doom and gloom either. Like you said earlier, the researchers found that neither group actually saw nuclear war as a foregone conclusion. So where does this disconnect, this misperception, where does it come from?
Right.
Is it how the media portrays Russia? Or maybe like leftover anxieties from the Cold War? What do you think?
Well, those are all great questions. And to be honest, this particular study didn't really dive into the why, but it does shine a big, bright spotlight on this danger we face, right? This danger of just accepting whatever we hear or read at face value, especially when it comes to entire nations.
Right.
I mean, think about it. How often do we encounter these sweeping statements about what the Russians think, what the Americans believe, without ever stopping to question, hey, who said that? And what's their agenda?
It's like that game of telephone, you know? Except instead of whispering some silly phrase, we're passing along these really weighty, significant assumptions that have real-world implications.
Exactly. And imagine, just for a second, if policymakers, the people making the decisions that affect all of us, imagine if they're working with information that's outdated, inaccurate, or just plain wrong about another country's stance on something as serious as nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of impact could that have on negotiations, on strategies to prevent conflict? It's almost impossible to overstate how dangerous that could be. Those misperceptions could easily create a very real cycle of mistrust and escalation, leading to, well, who knows where.
It's like playing a high-stakes poker game, but you fundamentally misunderstand your opponent's hand. You might think you're being strategic, playing it cool, but in reality, you're acting on a bluff.
Yeah.
And the stakes, well, they could be catastrophic.
That's a great analogy, and it gets at why this study is so important. It's a wake-up call for all of us. It's not enough to just be aware of the issues. We need to be critical, discerning about the information we consume, especially when it comes to something as crucial as international relations and the potential for conflict.
It sounds like this imbalanced co-orientation thing is not just some academic term. It's a real blind spot, and it could have some seriously bad consequences. So the million-dollar question is, what can we do about it? How do we even begin to bridge this gap in understanding between nations, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's kind of overwhelming when you really think about it, you know? Like, how do you even start to bridge that kind of gap between entire nations, especially on something as, well, as potentially terrifying as nuclear war? Where do we even begin?
It's daunting, no doubt, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think, honestly, it starts with recognizing that we all have a role to play here. Like, we're all part of the solution in a way. Okay, so it's not just about, like, you know, presidents and diplomats having chats in fancy rooms.
Exactly. We need more than just the official channels, right? We need genuine human connection, people talking to people. Imagine if more American and Russian students, for example, had the chance to study abroad, to actually live in each other's cultures, you know, to form friendships, challenge their own assumptions firsthand. I think those kinds of personal experiences, they can be really powerful.
It's one thing to read about another culture in a book, right? Or see it on the news. But it's got to be totally different to actually break bread with someone from that culture, to hear their stories, share your own.
Absolutely. And I think we also have to talk about education here, right? It's crucial that we're giving younger generations the tools, the critical thinking skills to navigate this complex world we live in.
Like how to cut through the noise.
Yeah, how to evaluate sources, recognize bias, and have respectful conversations. Even when they disagree with someone, those are skills that are valuable in every aspect of life, not just international relations.
It's about empowering them to look beyond the headlines, to dig a little deeper, form their own opinions.
Exactly. And, you know, this isn't just about preventing conflict, although that's obviously hugely important, but it's bigger than that. It's about creating a world where understanding and empathy are the norm, not the exception. It's about recognizing that, hey, even with our differences, whether it's language, culture, where we live, we're all connected. We share this planet.
Yeah, you're right. So I got to say, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling, well, hopeful, but also a sense of responsibility. You know, it's on all of us to really challenge those assumptions we carry around and really make the effort to understand the world and each other a little bit better.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So to everyone listening, next time you hear someone making a sweeping statement about an entire nation, any nation, take a second, hit that pause button and ask yourself, okay, is that really true? Where's this information coming from?
Yeah.
Look for those diverse perspectives, you know.
It's in those moments of critical thinking and open-mindedness, that we take a step back from the brink of misunderstanding and start moving towards a future where empathy and informed dialogue are guiding principles.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Remember, everyone, knowledge is power, but understanding is peace. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deeper.